So hello again, everyone. My name is May Whiting. I am the Data and Research Director at Alabama Possible, and we appreciate you joining us for our webinar titled Navigating Financial Aid for Immigrant Families, FAFSA Updates. So we have a lot to bring you today, but we are on the shorter end of things, so we're only going to be with you for 45 minutes unless you have a lot of questions, in which case we're definitely willing to stay on and answer those. But we're excited to cover this topic as we do have some recent updates directly from federal student aid. So I want to put a disclaimer out there. The information that we share with you today is current as of December 6th, 2023, but we want to make it known that information is subject to change all the way up until the start of the 2024-25 FAFSA cycle, which y'all know to be promoted as beginning by December 31st, 2023. Any updates that we have between now and December 31st, we will be sure to share with you, whether that's through our newsletter or on social media. So just stay tuned for any updates that we receive. Take a quick moment to thank all of our sponsors who make this programming at Alabama Goes to College possible. All of their support makes these professional development trainings completely free, and so we are definitely thankful for our sponsors. Additionally, we are grateful for our wonderful partners. We have the Alabama Commission on Higher Education, Alabama Community College System, Alabama State Department of Education, and then our great friends over at the Common Black College application, Get Educated, Edu Inc. Just a few housekeeping tips before we start. Please keep your microphones on mute at all times so that we can avoid feedback during the presentation. All of our webinars are recorded and posted to our YouTube channel, so you can find that at youtube.com/Alabama Possible. If you have any questions throughout the webinar today, feel free to use the Zoom chat feature to drop the questions there. Make sure that you have everyone selected when you type into the chat box, just so that we can all see your question and make sure no duplicate questions are asked. And then throughout today's webinar, we're going to have some poll questions. Particularly important are that our high school educators complete the poll questions towards the end of the webinar. That will ensure that you are eligible to receive your professional development credit. So as a reminder, PD credit is based on the duration of the webinar, how much you attend, and then also your responses to our poll questions. So make sure you hang on to the end. Again, this will only be 45 minutes today. We encourage you to share your commitment to building a college-going culture on social media. You can find us at AL Goes to College. You can find us on all the platforms seen here. And then we encourage you, especially as we build towards the opening of this new FAFSA cycle, that you use hashtags like hashtag FAFSA, hashtag Cash for College, to promote all the great work that you're doing in your schools and in your communities so that we can follow it and then share it as well. If you haven't already, although I know most of you have, if you're a high school educator whose school has not yet registered for our campaign, you can still register for the Alabama Goes to College campaign at alabamapossible.org/register 2023-24, and we will drop a link to that registration form in the chat. If you're not familiar, the Alabama Goes to College campaign is comprised of 3 different components. One is Cash for College, and that's what we'll be spending a lot of time on today. But our goal with the Cash for College initiative is for every single graduating senior in the state of Alabama to complete their FAFSA before they graduate. And the idea behind that is that the FAFSA gives them the largest source of financial aid towards post-secondary education. So it gives them access to federal, state, and institutional aid to pay for school after high school. So we're going to begin today with a poll question just to get an idea for everyone who's here. If you work with immigrant students, who is the main person supporting their college and career planning? So if you had to choose one person at your school, who's the person working most with these students as they prepare for life after high school? All right, so we have over 3/4 of people responding to this question, and 52% say that the counselor is the primary person working with immigrant students, followed by 29% of people saying the career coach. So awesome. That's helpful information for us just to know who's in the room with these students, who's reaching out to families who this applies to. So I appreciate your responses. All right. So our agenda today, we're going to quickly review some key terms. After that, we're going to describe federal aid eligibility based on citizenship status. And then after that, we are going to review updated steps to complete the 2024-25 FAFSA. So beginning with our key terms and their definitions. So when we're talking about immigrants, we're referring to people residing in the United States who were not US citizens at birth. And then when we're referring to undocumented individuals, we're referring to a person who entered the US legally and then their immigration status has expired, or we're referring to people who entered the US without authorization. And then lastly, we have a DACA recipient. This is a person who has been granted protection under Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And that's a program that provides protection from deportation, specifically to people brought to the US as children. So we'll be using these words throughout the webinar and just kind of want to ground everyone in those definitions. So this is just a reminder, this hasn't changed except for one bullet point on the next slide, but just to remind folks who is eligible for federal aid. So here we're just specifically talking about federal aid, not state aid, not institutional aid, or any other kind of aid. We're just talking about federal. So to be fully eligible to accept federal aid, students must be a US citizen, US national, or eligible non-citizen. And we'll define that last one in a few slides. So that is a requirement to accept federal aid. Along with that, they have to have a valid social security number. And there is an exception to this, the exception being students from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of Palau. And then students also have to have a high school diploma or GED, or they have to have completed an approved homeschool education or meet one of the ability to benefit alternatives. More to be fully eligible to accept federal aid, and this one that has the star next to it is new this year. So if you've been on any of our other FAFSA webinars throughout the fall, you've heard that a big part of this new FAFSA is that students and their contributors will have to provide consent and approval. And they're providing consent and approval to have their federal tax info transferred directly from the IRS to the Department of Education so that it can be in their 2024-25 FAFSA. So this is a new part to be fully eligible. It will be continuously repeated throughout the FAFSA that they have to provide consent and approval. So if they don't initially provide consent, they will be asked again and again, will you provide consent and approval? And then the others are the same from previous years. The student has to be enrolled and accepted as a regular student in an eligible degree or certificate program. And then while they're in college, they have to maintain satisfactory academic progress, however that is defined by their particular school. And then they have to sign certifying statements on the FAFSA. So these are the eligibility requirements for federal aid, and we wanted to bring them up specifically because we're going to talk a lot about these terms that we saw in the first bullet. So a US citizen is a person who is born in the 50 states or the District of Columbia, and then in most cases, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Guam, and the Northern Mariana Islands. And then a US citizen is also most persons born abroad to parents or a parent who are US citizens themselves. US national includes natives of American Samoa or Swains Island. And then we move into this big category of eligible non-citizens. So again, we're talking about students here. If a student is not a US citizen or US national, they might be an eligible non-citizen if they can provide any of the documentation that you see bulleted here. So our biggest category of eligible non-citizen is going to be a permanent resident. So this is someone who has a green card. Outside of that, we also have refugees, asylees, parolees. Those are folks who will have an arrival departure record. And then we have folks who are on a T visa. So these are victims of human trafficking. We have folks who are victims of abuse under the battered immigrant status. And then we have people who are citizens of the geographies we listed earlier. And then folks who have status under the J Treaty. So these are Canadian-born Native Americans. So everyone outlined here could be an eligible non-citizen, making them eligible for federal aid. And then we have ineligible non-citizens. So if a student is not a citizen or an eligible non-citizen, then they will not be eligible for federal student aid. So the folks who are not eligible for federal student aid are those who've been granted DACA. So that is the term that we defined on our first screen. For students who have only received a notice of approval to apply for permanent residence, but are not yet a permanent resident, they're not eligible for federal student aid. And then we have F1, F2, and M1 student visa students, as well as J1 and J2 exchange visitor visa students, and then anyone on a G series visa, and then anyone with no protected status at all, so an undocumented student. All of these folks are going to be ineligible non-citizens who are not eligible for federal student aid. And because they're not eligible for federal student aid, they should use the available opt-out waiver because they cannot and should not complete a FAFSA. So in order to meet the graduation requirement, they should complete an opt-out waiver. So now we're going to move into our steps to completing the FAFSA. And we're really just going to focus mostly on step 1 today, because that is the step that federal student aid has released the most information around for our immigrant families. But we will touch a little bit on steps 2 through 4 and what we know so far about the new FAFSA. But I will say we don't know much. And so because of that, we are going to have a second webinar in January where we talk more about the details of completing the FAFSA for immigrant families. Right now, we're just kind of giving you an update of what we know so far. So step 1, creating an FSA ID. As most of you know, an FSA ID is the username and password for accessing your federal student aid account. So students and their relevant family members will go to studentaid.gov to create the FSA ID. And for most students, we encourage them to create that in advance of December. So we're in December now, so hopefully a lot of your students have already done that. But we'll talk about how certain populations have not yet had an opportunity to create an FSA ID because there's a new process around it. So this year with this new FAFSA, an FSA ID is actually required to start the FAFSA form. In the past, people had the ability to just enter personal identifiers to start a FAFSA, but that's no longer an option. You actually have to have an FSA ID to start the form. So the FSA ID has to be authenticated. So we encourage folks to allow 3 days for that authentication process. And that being said, we encourage you, if you're having workshops for your students, FAFSA workshops, that they have worked on their FSA ID 3 days prior to that workshop. A big part of the FSA ID this year is that a verified email address is required. So tell your students to not use a shared email address or an email address that's temporary and that they'll eventually lose access to, like their high school email or a work email that will not continue on with them past their employment. So encourage your families and the students to use personal emails, whether that's Gmail or any other platform, and one that they'll have forever since they'll continue to complete a FAFSA each year that they're in a post-secondary program. So who needs an FSA ID? This totally depends on whether the student in question is considered dependent or independent for the purposes of the FAFSA. So in order to make that determination, they're going to answer questions that we'll have linked in the chat, but it's a series of dependency questions that determines whether or not a student is a dependent, and if they are, then they have to include their parents' information on the FAFSA. So we have that reiterated here. So an independent student will only need to have an FSA ID for themselves and then their spouse if they're married and they did not file taxes with their spouse. But a dependent student will need their own FSA ID, and then a parent or their parents will also need their own FSA IDs. So which parent creates an FSA ID and then reports their information on the FAFSA is going to depend on several factors. So we have a resource that's called Is My Parent a Contributor? And we highly recommend that y'all consult with that flow chart before instructing a student's family member to create an FSA ID. We don't want to have them spending time on a process that's totally unnecessary. So before anyone other than a student creates an FSA ID, you want to make sure that they're actually required to, and that they're required to provide their information on the FAFSA. And then one note here, in 2-parent households, both parents will need FSA IDs if they do not file taxes as married filing jointly. If they file taxes as married filing jointly together, then only one of the parents in a 2-parent household will need an FSA ID. So this is the graphic, the flow chart that I was referencing. It's available in our educators toolkit. So the questions that it runs through first are your biological or adoptive parents married to each other? If yes, then your parents' marital status is married, and so both of your parents' information will be included on the FAFSA. And then, like I mentioned, if the parents did not file taxes jointly, then both of the parents will need FSA IDs. But if the student's parents are not married, they'll go on to the second question. Did your biological or adoptive parents live together? If yes, then the parents are unmarried and both of the parents will provide their information. So both will need FSA IDs. But if the student's parents are not married and they do not live together, then the question is, did one parent provide more financial support than the other over the past 12 months? For whichever parent provided the most financial support, the student will report information for that parent. So that parent will need to create an FSA ID. And then if they are remarried, so the student has a step parent, that person will also need to report their information on the FAFSA. So as long as you go through and answer these questions accurately, you should know exactly who to include on a student's FAFSA. Again, this is for dependent students who are required to provide parental information on the FAFSA. As a reminder, a parent is only a biological or adoptive parent. So this is not including grandparents, aunts, uncles, older siblings, anyone that the student lives with outside of a parent. The FAFSA only cares about a biological or adoptive parent. So as it relates to FSA IDs, this year, a parent without a social security number, including undocumented parents, will have to create an FSA ID. So in the past, they did not have an option to do so. This year, they're going to have to create an FSA ID. So it's going to work through a totally new system, and that system's not going to be available until the new FAFSA opens. So since these parents are going to have to verify their identity in order to create their FSA ID, there is no longer any option to enter all zeros for a social security number like there was in the past. And then there's also not an option to mail in a signature page for them to sign the FAFSA. So those two things that we used to do, if you've been an educator in this work for a while, those are no longer an option. Instead, every single person who is contributing to a FAFSA is going to have to create an FSA ID. And then one note for some undocumented parents, they might have an ITIN or an individual taxpayer identification number. They're not going to use that ITIN in place of a social security number. So lots of our undocumented families do still file federal income taxes, and they do that with their ITIN, but their ITIN is not seen as a replacement for their social security number for the purposes of creating an FSA ID. So here's a screenshot of what the FSA ID creation process looks like. At the bottom, when it asks for social security number, they're going to check a box that says, I do not have a social security number. Again, right now we're talking about parents. So as a reminder, students are going to have a social security number, but the population we're talking about right now are parents without social security numbers. So because the FSA ID won't be authenticating through the Social Security Administration, the parent will be presented with knowledge-based identity questions provided by TransUnion. So what a credit bureau would typically use to verify someone's identity, they might ask questions like the person's previous address, their phone number, their former employers, a loan amount, things like that to make a match and verify that this person is out in the world in other ways. If the parent is successful and is able to verify their identity through answers to these questions, then the FSA ID will be authenticated and then it will be available to use immediately. If they're not able to verify their identity through responses to these questions, then they will have to manually submit acceptable documentation. So we'll link you to an article that details this documentation, and then we're also going to cover it in our slides, but just so that you have that article with a little more information on hand, we have it linked in our slides. So just to kind of talk through this a little bit, we know that for our undocumented families, a lot of them are trying to, live off the grid, not be known. So the questions presented by TransUnion might present a challenge for our undocumented family. So we want to recognize that and kind of talk through what the process looks like. So when they're creating their FSA ID, they're going to see a warning to say your account will be limited without a social security number. But they'll basically say, I'm a parent of a student applying for aid and I do not have a social security number. And then they'll continue on without that social security number. And that tells federal student aid that they need to be presented with the knowledge-based questions. So these knowledge-based identity verification questions will be asked at the end of the FSA ID creation process. So you can see here, it's a little bit small, hopefully you can see. On page 7 of 7, they'll be presented these questions. And then the person responding will only have one chance to answer those questions correctly. If the match is successful, they'll see the left screen saying their account was successfully created. If the match is unsuccessful, they'll see this right screen saying that they need to contact federal student aid. So if they can't verify their identity through responses to the questions, they're going to have to do the following. They'll contact FSA to open up a case. They're going to complete an attestation form. Then they're going to submit acceptable documentation to prove their identity. And then ideally receive email confirmation that documents were verified and that their identity was matched. So we'll talk a little bit more about this. So when they're going through the process, after they've completed their attestation form, they have options to prove their identity. So they have to use acceptable, unexpired documents, and they can use one of the following: either a driver's license, state or city identification card, foreign passport. And if they don't use any of those three, then they have the option to submit a utility bill and one of the following: a municipal identification card, a community ID, and a consular identification card. Now, federal student aid has not given more details on how each of these are defined, so we're still waiting for more information on this. But in our experience, working with undocumented families, the vast majority of them do not have any of these forms of ID. So again, we recognize that this will present a significant challenge to our students who have undocumented parents. So again, just recognizing that, and as the new FAFSA opens, we'll stay up to date on how things are being handled and try to keep you updated with the best guidance that we have for moving through this process. So if a parent without a social security number is both unable to complete the knowledge-based questions or the manual identity proofing, then filing a paper FAFSA might be the only option. So it would be a last resort, but we could see this as kind of the last thing we turn to, especially as we're waiting for further guidance. So I just kind of want to do a recap of everything we just covered to make sure it's clear. So we're specifically talking about parents without social security numbers. So who could this impact? We could be working with a citizen student, so a high school senior who is a US citizen, whose parents are not US citizens and might be undocumented and therefore don't have a social security number. And so even though the student themselves is a US citizen, their parents' lack of citizenship status might impact how they move through the FAFSA process. So we're going to keep kind of reiterating this throughout. So we spent a lot of time on step one, the FSA ID creation process, because that's what we have the most information on. But just to quickly go through steps 2 through 4. Step 2 is gathering all the documents that we need to complete the FAFSA. And I've highlighted this second bullet because for our students who aren't US citizens, but are eligible non-citizens, those eligible non-citizen students who are eligible for federal aid will have to provide an alien registration number like they always have on the FAFSA. So I think, okay, and I wasn't sure if we had a screenshot of that, but it looks about the same as it always has. They'll just have an option to indicate their citizenship status. And when they indicate that they're an eligible non-citizen, it will prompt them for the alien registration number. So then moving into step 3, our actual application, students are going to see the following sections on their portion of the FAFSA. So they'll have a personal circumstances section, a demographics section, followed by financials, colleges, and signature. And in the student's personal circumstances section, they, or if they're a dependent student, are going to need to submit the name, date of birth, social security number, and email address of their parent or their contributor. So how this affects our immigrant families. If the parent does not have a social security number, the student will instead provide a mailing address. So we have some screenshots of this. So again, this is if a dependent student is filling out the FAFSA. When they go to invite their parents to complete the parent portion of the FAFSA, they have to enter in the parent's social security number. And if the parent doesn't have one, they're going to check the box and instead enter in a mailing address. Oh, here's the screenshot I was looking for earlier. But in the demographics section, the student is going to answer a question about their citizenship status. If they indicate they're an eligible non-citizen, they are going to need to provide an A number. Both students and contributors will need to consent to having their federal tax information directly transferred from the IRS in order to be eligible for federal aid. So as I was mentioning earlier on in today's webinar, the consent process will continuously be brought up throughout the FAFSA. So it is prompting the student to approve, to provide consent and approve this process. And so how this impacts our immigrant families is we know that our immigrant families have all different kinds of tax situations. Like I said, some undocumented families do still file federal income taxes, and they do so with an I-10. Some undocumented families do not file income taxes. So there's all kinds of scenarios and situations that we might be working with. So like I said, parents without social security numbers might have an I-10 to file their federal income taxes. And if the parent indicates that they do not have a social security number, then at some point on the FAFSA, they will be prompted to provide their I-10 so that their tax data can be pulled from the IRS. So they need some kind of way to know how to get the parent's taxes. And if the parent is filing taxes with an I-10, they'll need to provide that I-10 on the FAFSA. So kind of a recap, how does the citizenship status of a parent impact a student? So the citizenship status of a parent does not impact the student's aid eligibility, but it does impact how the FAFSA is completed. And then it might also impact some of the steps that follow submission of the FAFSA. So the student, after submitting the FAFSA, they might have some follow-up tasks to complete if they're selected for verification or if their college needs more information from them. And we know that for our students with undocumented parents, that tasks like providing income and tax documents might present some challenges. So in that instance, we strongly recommend that students with undocumented parents complete their FAFSA with an advocate who can guide them through the process from start to finish. And that not only applies to completing the actual FAFSA form, but also navigating conversations after their FAFSA has been submitted. So if the student is having a conversation with someone at the financial aid office of the college where they intend to enroll, we strongly recommend that student be accompanied by an advocate to just navigate the conversation. We don't want any of our students with undocumented parents to feel unsafe or to feel like the FAFSA presents a threat to them in any way. So we highly recommend an advocate be with them, whether that's us or any of our wonderful community partners, such as HICA or the Hispanic Interest Coalition of Alabama. So key takeaways, and I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm repeating myself over and over, but I know this is a really complicated area, so I want to be a bit redundant. So only a student's citizenship status impacts their aid eligibility. And like we saw at the beginning of these slides, US citizens, US nationals, and then eligible non-citizens are eligible for federal student aid and should complete a FAFSA. So a student's aid eligibility only depends on their own citizenship status. Now, if they're a dependent student and they have to provide parent information, a parent's citizenship status does not impact the student's aid eligibility, but again, it might impact the steps for completing the FAFSA. And then this year, a parent without a social security number must create an FSA ID, and that will be using a totally new process that's not going to be available until the new FAFSA opens. As of right now, we know that opening date to be December 31st. If it's earlier, we'll certainly make a huge announcement. But these are our key takeaways. So I just want to plug a few resources before we open it up for questions. Federal Student Aid has a Better FAFSA landing page. Feel free to consult that. They post lots of resources. They also have their hotline, which we don't necessarily recommend contacting right now, but that hotline is a resource for you once the new FAFSA opens. Our Educators Toolkit has a Cash for College subfolder, so you can find that at alabamapossible.org/educator-toolkit. And then many of y'all might be familiar with the National College Attainment Network, or NCAN. They have a Better FAFSA training toolkit, and they are continuously updating it with new information as federal student aid releases it. So feel free to consult that resource as well. Federal Student Aid is posting short little videos, not necessarily related to immigrant families. I actually don't think any of their videos pertain to immigrant families, but if you want to look at their playlist just to see what they have up right now, these are short videos that you could easily share through a mass email to your students and families, especially around creating a student aid account and gathering documents in preparation for the FAFSA. We have a help desk, so you as educators can call us, your students and families can call us. They can also text us at 334-316-6155. So we do expect lots of questions to come in as soon as the FAFSA actually opens up. But definitely want to get to questions, and then don't forget we also will have our poll towards the end to be eligible for professional development credit. So Yoruba, if you'd like to come on and give some of the questions, I'll also look through the chat too.
Sure. So our first question was, does this mean they cannot manually input the information, only direct transfer? So this was pertaining to taxes.
So the upgraded FAFSA, the whole goal is for most people to have their tax information directly transferred so that it's a much more seamless process. That being said, there still are populations who will not be able to use what's being called the direct data exchange now. And these populations will have to do some manual input. Right now, we know very little about what that looks like because the screenshots that have been released are all assuming that folks are able to use the direct data exchange. So we have pretty limited information on what the manual process will look like. But no, there still is an option to do a manual process.
Okay, and then we have another one that says, when will the opt-out waivers be available? And then Lisa had a second question with that. It says, is the FSA ID required for using the opt-out waiver?
I believe last I was told the opt-out waiver was available as of December 1st. If anyone from the Department of Education would like to correct me on that, I heard that it would be available December 1st. We know that's important for our students who are mid-year graduates. So if you have high school seniors who are graduating in December, and obviously the FAFSA is not open, so they can't complete their FAFSA yet, please feel free to use the opt-out waiver, assuming it's available to you. Otherwise, we highly discourage using the opt-out waiver for our high school seniors who have a May graduation date, May or June graduation date. We really want to work with as many students as possible to ensure that they're keeping their financial aid options open. And we know that they do that by completing the FAFSA. So We'll see if anyone has a response about the waiver. If not, we'll follow up with you after. And then in terms of the second question, I'm not quite sure I understand it, but a student will either complete the FAFSA, and that involves creating an FSA ID, or they'll complete an opt-out waiver. So it's one or the other. They'll do the FAFSA or they'll do an opt-out waiver.
This is Dr. Mack. I can address the waivers.
Oh, yes.
We are working on that now, so it should be coming out this week. If you have additional questions regarding the waiver, feel free to send me an email and I can address your specific questions.
Perfect. Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Another question we have is, will their children be able to receive the Pell Grant? So this is for the undocumented parents.
So if a student is eligible for aid based on their citizenship status, their parent status won't impact them. It might present hurdles to the process, but what we're committed to doing is if a student is having trouble navigating any part of the FAFSA with their parent, if their parent's undocumented, we'll do everything we can to get through as much as possible. Like I mentioned, if the electronic version of the FAFSA is presenting significant challenges, a paper version of the FAFSA is kind of a last resort. And then as far as the student is comfortable, knowing this is a very delicate situation, we would advocate for the student with the financial aid office of their college. If the student's a US citizen, they should be able to receive federal student aid, no problem. But we know, like, the way the FAFSA is asking questions, it might be difficult to answer them all and provide all the necessary information. So whether it's filing a paper FAFSA or advocating for the student with the financial aid office at the college, one way or another, the student should be able to receive an aid package to include Pell Grant aid.
Okay, and I believe you answered this question. So undocumented parents cannot get their FSA ID until FAFSA opens.
That's correct. The current link for creating an FSA ID is just the process as it has always existed. It doesn't currently have that. I don't believe it currently has that checkbox where they can say, I do not have a social security number. So because of that, undocumented parents are going to need to wait to create their FSA IDs.
Okay. And what if the undocumented parent does not have any tax information?
If they don't have tax information, then they're not going to pull any tax information through. They're going to answer questions about their financial situation using any kind of supporting documentation they have, whether that's W-2, they probably won't have that. Whether it's a 1099 miscellaneous, probably won't have that. Whether it's pay stubs, any kind of record they have of pay that they've accumulated throughout the year. The challenge comes with as they're answering questions about their financial situation, it might prompt the college to say, oh, they have enough income to warrant filing taxes. And then if they're not filing taxes, then they would be requested to do so. So there's all different kinds of ways this could play out. Be happy to follow up with you about specific situations. But if they don't have tax info, they can still answer questions about their financial situation. However, that might lead to even more questions. So I want to take a pause with the questions. We'll come back to those right after we do the polls, because I don't want to hold people up since we committed to 45 minutes today. So I'm just going to launch our first poll. If you would please respond to these two questions about satisfaction. All right, ending now and going on to our second set of questions. You should see those on your screen now. And just as a quick reminder, as I know folks might have to hop off, we are going to have essentially a part 2 to this in January, and we will have our great friends from HECA on that webinar. So ideally, we have way more information to share with you on the second webinar. We just wanted to get this information out to you before the holiday break so that you at least know how to guide families in the very first part of the FAFSA, which is creating their FSA ID. Perfect. All right, so we will continue on with our questions.
Okay, our next question was, will this video or presentation be shared with us?
Absolutely. So that will be on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Alabama Possible, and we'll have that link provided in our follow-up email to you.
Okay. Our next question is, do you have an infographic that lists all of the documents needed to start FAFSA? And I can answer that. On my end, I actually was working on that recently, and so that should be completed and posted in the Cash for College folder. We wanted to make sure we had the most current information, so that should be posted in the inbox today in the shareable folders. Let's see, the next one will be, what if one parent files taxes but one doesn't?
So just to make sure I understand the question correctly, are you talking about undocumented parents specifically who are married and then one of them files taxes as if they're single?
And Josephine said yes.
Okay, so it's hard to answer a question unless you have a specific situation in mind, in which case feel free to reach out. But when the FAFSA asks the student all of the questions to first determine if they're a dependent, and then once confirming they're a dependent, then ask them all the questions about which parent's information to report. If they're having to report information about both parents, and both parents have income, but only one parent files taxes, it's a complicated scenario. It sounds like in that case, both parents are going to have to create an FSA ID, and one parent would be pulling through their tax information, and the other parent would be manually answering financial questions. But if you'd like to reach out to us, definitely feel free to email us, because it helps to get more detail to see how to address it. But for this year, because any contributor has to have an FSA ID, any married parents who don't file their taxes together, both parent will have to create an FSA ID, and then both parent will have to fill out the parent portion of the FAFSA. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Okay, our next question is, does the toolbox contain a parent letter to provide to students? I was going to ask Rhonda for more clarification. Are you saying a general letter or for students who have parents that are undocumented?
We do have a general letter that probably needs updating, potentially, but I don't think we have a specific letter for immigrant families, but what we do have is an FAQ. Although I believe the FAQ is just for undocumented families, not necessarily all kinds of immigrant families. So would you want a general one for all populations and then also immigrant student populations?
She said general would be great for updating.
Okay. Yeah, we can work on that.
Our next question is, do you have an update on the trial FAFSA release for counselors and career coaches to review prior to the official release? I can answer that. I posted the link for the 2024-25 FAFSA prototype. That's the best information that we can share, because we've been told that there will not be a demo site released at all this year. Once they post the actual FAFSA, they will not have a demo. So the best that we can do is provide you all with the prototype, and that has an access code. It's prototype 2425. So that's in your chat.
And my understanding with the prototype is that it's a bit limited in the scenarios that you can run to, but you can at least run through the most common scenarios. I know for the more complex situations that educators often encounter, I'm not sure the prototype will be as useful to you, but at least you can see the look and feel of the FAFSA, which is all brand new. That should definitely be helpful. Yeah, feel free to reach out to us. You can email us, algoestocollege@alabamapossible.org. You can also text or call our help desk line if you have further questions, but expect a follow-up email from us shortly, and then we'll also get a recording of this webinar up on our YouTube channel. And then we do hope to see you after you have taken a well-deserved break for the holidays. We hope to see you in January for a follow-up to this conversation, ideally with way more answers than we had today. So thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you soon.